Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to this video titled Solving Percent Problems. You will need to get out your Go Math book and turn to page 215. Get out your math journal, pencil, and also a calculator. Now the goal for this video is for you to understand how you use percents to solve different problems. Now we're going to look at how to find a percent of a number, finding a percent given a part of and a whole, and also finding a whole given a part of a percent. Okay, you may think that's a lot to understand, but we'll go through this step by step. Now, the key tip that I want you to understand at the very beginning of this video is that a percent is always out of 100. So whenever you're writing a percent as a fraction, you always have the percent as a numerator, and then 100 is going to be your denominator. Even if the percent is 150%, still always out of 100. Okay, so that's very important because when we go through these different problems, we're going to set these problems up as a proportion. And part of the issue with a proportion is trying to figure out which number goes on the top and which number goes on the bottom. But if you can always remember that a percent is always out of 100, then you'll be able to know that if we're dealing with something that's 37% and you're setting up as a proportion, you at least know that it's going to be 37 over 100. That's at least one part of that proportion. So that's very important to understand right from the beginning. Now, if you turn your Go Math book to page 216, it says finding a percent of a number. Okay, so understand that a percent is equivalent to the ratio of a part to a whole. To find a percent of a number, you can write a ratio to represent the percent and find an equivalent ratio that compares the part to a whole. So for example, if we're looking at 30% of 400, we can set it up as a proportion like this. 30 over 100 equals something over 400. Okay, or what we could do, whenever we see that word of, that means multiplication, we can take 30% and multiply it by 400, just like this. 30 over 100 times 400 gives us 120. Okay, so those are two different ways that we can solve these problems. Now we're going to take a look at some of these problems on page 217, and I'm going to do a couple of these problems for you, and then we're going to do some together. So we have 38% of 50. So we're trying to figure out what number is 38% of the number 50. So there's two ways of doing this. Understanding that a percent is always out of 100, we could set this up as a proportion. 38 over 100 is going to equal a number over 50. Okay, now whenever you're doing these problems, it's important to understand where the numbers go. Because if I were to put 50 as my numerator, then that would throw the whole problem off. Now, the reason why 50 is in line with 100, because 50 is the total amount. Okay, so 100% is the total amount, 50 is the total amount. We're trying to figure out what number is 38% of 50. Okay, so whenever we have these types of problems set up, 38 over 100, the percent over 100, and then this number, so 50, 375 is always going to be in line with the 100% because that represents the total amount. So, excuse me, what we do, 38 times 50, that's going to give us 1,900. And then we divide it by our 100, and that's going to give us 19. So 38 over 100 equals 19 over 50, or we can understand that 38% of 50 is 19. Another way to figure this problem out, what we can do is multiply 38% times 50. Whenever we see that word of, that means multiplication. So a way of doing this would be 38 over 100 times 50. That would give you 19. If you want to even make this easier, remember whenever we take a percentage and we turn it into a decimal, we move that decimal 2 places to the left. So 0.38 times 50 would give you 19 as well. So those are all the different ways that you could solve that problem. Setting up as a proportion, or even taking that decimal, that percent into a decimal, and then multiply it by that number. I don't want to confuse you with too many ways of doing this, but just understand that there are multiple ways to solve this problem. So let's do this one together. I want you to write this out with me. So we have 27% of 300. So we write 27 over 100 is going to equal something over 300. So my first step, whenever we set it up like a proportion, we cross multiply. We've done this a lot. 27 times 300. That's going to give me 8,100. And then now what we do is we take 8,100, we divide that by 100. And that'll give us 81. So 27% of 300 equals 81. Now let me show you number 7. We're going to do this by multiplying. So let's do this together. 60% of 75 equals what number? So again, whenever we see that word of, that means multiplication. So what we can do is just take 0.60. Where am I getting that from? If we take 60%, remember we move that decimal 2 places to the left. So that's how you take a percent and turn it into a whole number. Why is it 2 places to the left? Remember, 60, a percentage is always out of 100. So think of it as 60 over 100, okay, or 60 hundredths. So we take that 60 hundredths, we multiply it by 75, and then we get 45. So that's another way of doing it. 2 different ways to solve this type of problem. So 60% of 75 equals 45. Now, we're going to go to the next section, which is on page 218. It says find a percent given a part and a whole. So what it says is that you can use proportion reasoning to solve problems in which you need to find a percent. So good old proportions coming back again. So what we're doing here, a couple things we need to understand. Remember, a percent is always out of 100. And that 100% always represents the total amount. It doesn't matter if you only have 3 of something, okay? If 3 is the total amount, 3 will equal 100%. If you have 9,786 of something, if you have 9,876 of something, that equals 100%. So the total amount always equals 100%. Understand that. So when we're trying to figure out a percent given a part and a whole, remember a whole is going to equal 100%. So what we have here for the problem at the bottom of page 218, it says out of the 25 students in Mrs. Green's class, 25 students, that's going to be the whole, 19 have a pet. What percent of the students in Mrs. Green's class have a pet? So setting this up as a proportion, they've given you the first one here. We have 19 over 25. That means 19 out of the 25 students have a pet. Now we got to figure out what other fraction we would write. They're asking us about a percent. So we know that the total amount is always going to equal 100. Okay, so we have 19 over 25. This is the total. This is the total. Is going to equal something over 100. So we set this up as a proportion. We take 19 times 100. Remember, cross multiply. It's going to give us 1,900. And then what we do is we divide 1,900 divided by 25. And what's that going to give us? 76 over 100. Now, it doesn't say 76 students have it. They're asking what percent of the students have a pet. So that is 76%. So we've been given a part. That's always going to be the numerator. The whole is going to be the denominator. Setting up as a proportion, denominator will always be 100. Why is that? Because remember, a percent is always out of 100. So let's take a look at another one here. So we have Elena spent $21 part of her $300 whole paycheck on a gift. What percent of her paycheck was spent on the gift? So for this problem, we set it up as a proportion. We take 21 over 300. Why is that? Because 21 is part of the check. $300 equals 100% of the check. So that easily shows me, whoops, that should just be 100 there. That easily shows me how to set up my proportion. 21 over 300 equals something over 100. Why 100? Because a percent's always out of 100. And I would like for you to do this with me if you have not been doing it already. So we take 21 times 100, set it up as a proportion, cross multiply. We know how to do this. Probably do this in our sleep by now. Gives us 2,100. And now my next step is we divide by that next number. We divide by 300. And that's going to give us 7, which equals 7%. What percent of her paycheck was spent on the gift? 7% of the $300 was spent on the gift. So again, when you're setting this up as a proportion, the part will be as the numerator. The whole will be as the denominator. The whole is always going to equal 100. Remember, percent always is always out of 100. So the total amount is always going to represent 100%. Okay, now we are going to take a look at finding a whole given a part and a percent. Remember, a percent is always out of 100, so that's going to help us out as we set up a proportion. So what we have here, and I want you to do this problem with me, it's on the bottom of page 219. It says that 6 is 30% of a certain number. Now, whenever we see the word is, that represents equals. So in other words, it says 6 equals 30% of a certain number. Now, setting this up as a proportion, we always know that percentages are always out of 100. So we have 30 over 100 is going to equal 6, but we don't know the number there. Okay, now remember, 6 is only a part of this number, so that's why 6 would go on top. And why does that equal 100? Because that's the total amount. So again, setting up like a proportion, we have 6 times 100. That's going to give us 600. We divide by that other number, which is 30, and that will give us 20. So setting this up as a proportion, understanding that key tip that a percent is always out of 100. That's going to show you at least one of the ratios that you set up when you're setting up as a proportion, and then you just need to figure the other one out, understanding that 6 is just 30% of something. Okay, and because of that, 6 is not going to equal 100, it's just a part of it. So we put 6 on top and that missing number on the bottom, right across from 100%. Now let's take a look at number 12. Let's do this together. So this has 15% of a certain number is 75. Okay, so what we're seeing here is 15% over 100, or I should say 15 over 100, that's part of our proportion, is going to equal 75 over a certain number. Now, where am I getting this from? 15% of a certain number is 75. So the word is going to mean equal. So in other words, 15 equals 75. So it goes right across from there. And since This is a part of it. What we do is we have that part of 75 here at the top. The total would be at the bottom there. So what we do, multiply 75 times 100. Again, cross multiply. That gives us 7,500. And we take that 7,500 and we divide it by that other number, which is 15. And we can see that 15% of 500 is 75. Now we can put 500 right here. A way to check this would be able to see if these are equal ratios. Multiply 100 times 5 will give you 500. Multiply 15 times 5 will give you 75. So that way you know you have the correct answer there. So this concludes the video on solving percent problems. If you have any questions about this concept, please come and see me.